Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our sixth and final for this series, Eco Lunch and Learn. This one is with Alison Copeland, the red listing of Bermuda's endemic plants. And Alison was the Biodiversity Officer for the Bermuda Government's Department of Environment and Natural Resources for 14 years, from 2008 until August of last year. During that time, she undertook projects studying the ecology, distribution and conservation of Bermuda's rare plants, particularly the ferns. Alison left Bermuda in September 2022 to begin a PhD in biosciences at Durham University. Her current research focus is Bermuda's invasive plants and the novel communities they form with our indigenous species. Alison has a Master of Science degree in marine habitat mapping from Memorial University of Newfoundland and a postgraduate certificate in ecological survey techniques from Oxford University. I would also add that Alison has given so much of her time, both as a trustee with the Walsingham Trust and volunteering with the National Trust, the Buy Back Bermuda, and helping out enormously with the BBS, the Bermuda Botanical Society, to which I can attest because she's been a big personal help there with all sorts of things plant-wise. I could go on, but we're here to listen to Alison. So thank you, Alison, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Get on to my first slide. So this lecture is about endemic plants, and I just wanted to take a moment to make sure that everybody knows what that means and why that's important. And endemic species are only found in Bermuda. So that's important in this context, because if we lose the plant from Bermuda, that's it. That's global extinction. And extinction is the end of a species forever. So the IUCN Red List, sorry? The IUCN Red List that I'm going to talk about assesses the extinction risk that species face, and it places them into categories based on that risk. So at this moment in time, extinction is not reversible. We don't yet have mammoths walking out of test tubes. So if you think of extinction like falling off a cliff, once you've fallen off a cliff, you can't unfall. Extinction is, however, hard to confirm. So when we see headlines like this with species coming back to life, they were never really extinct to begin with. So I have to apologize for this slide. I'm not an artist, so we'll have to make do with PowerPoint's selection of clip arts here. But if we're going to think of extinction like falling off a cliff, then you have your drivers of extinction, which are lined up here on the top of the cliff, and they're all pushing together to push this poor tree off the cliff. And you have things here like climate change and natural disasters. You have pests and diseases. You have alien species. You have predators. And then you have things like habitat destruction or development. Now, countering those things, you have your pull factors. So those are your conservation actions that are helping to pull that species back from the edge of the cliff. So we have these dedicated people here ready to catch it. We have this guy here who's spreading the word about the plight of our tree, and this person here running in with some money. You have things like protected areas and legislation. You have seed banks and plant nurseries. So you get the idea. All of these push and pull factors are what you consider when you do this sort of red list assessment. So endangered is a word that gets misused a lot, but in this case, it has a very precise meaning. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they maintain this red list, which is recognized as the global standard for assessing and reporting on species extinction risks, and what we call their conservation status. So these are based on robust criteria and scientific methods. So I'm going to talk about the assessment process in a minute, but I just wanted to show you this slide, which is the possible results of an assessment. So if we start down here at the bottom, you have all species on Earth. So if no one's tried to do an assessment of it, it gets called not evaluated. If somebody has done a red list assessment, but they've found that they don't have enough information to assess the extinction risk, then it gets called data deficient. If someone has managed to do an assessment, but they found that the species is not at significant risk of extinction, it goes into that least concern category. And these are species that are widely distributed around the world. Maybe they don't face any threats and they have stable wild populations. The category next to that is near threatened. And these are species that have been assessed as okay for now. But if something changes in the future, or the population continues to decline, they could meet the criteria for being put into one of those threatened categories. And these threatened three categories in the middle here are the ones that the red list mainly deals with. I'm going to show you how those are assessed in a minute. But if we look up at the top here, we have extinct and extinct in the wild. And you can list an extinct species on the red list. So, for example, some of Bermuda's birds that are only known from the fossil record, they actually appear on the red list with that extinct status. Extinct in the wild means that there is scientific evidence that it's disappeared from habitats where it was formerly found. So these are species that are now only known from zoos and aquariums and botanic gardens and similar captive settings. So if we go back to thinking about extinction as falling off a cliff, the species in that black category are lying at the bottom of that cliff. The species that are extinct in the wild, they're standing on the edge of the cliff with 1 foot out in space. Those critically endangered species are 1 step back from the edge, endangered 2 steps back, vulnerable 3 steps back, etc. So those are all the possible outcomes of a red list assessment. So this is an example of what the red list looks like. It can be found at this web address. And the red list is updated 2 or 3 times a year as new assessments are done or old assessments are updated. And they also periodically change the criteria that are used for assessing species. So I'm going to show you the assessment for the Bermuda cedar as an example of how we get the outcome of the assessment. And this is the outcome down here. It's critically endangered. I've blown it up on this side here. And if you look at this, you have all these letters and numbers, which are the criteria that are used to arrive at that assessment. So this sheet is what the criteria look like, and this is really the meat of an assessment. You start at the top here with A. We have population size reductions, and that's the first criteria that we assess for extinction risk. And for the Bermuda cedar, I think most of you know that in the 1940s, at least 2 species of scale insects were accidentally introduced, and they attacked the cedar trees and killed a lot of them very quickly. So for the cedar, a massive and rapid population decline is clearly contributing to its risk of extinction. So we have to consider criteria A for the cedar. So people were observing the trees dying around them. So it was an observed decline, and it was in the past. But also we can't gather up all the scale insects and get rid of them. So the cause of the decline is still present, and it's not reversible. So because of those reasons, we're looking at A2 here. Also, we have written records from the 1950s that estimate the decline of around 90 to 95%. So that puts us quite squarely in this red box for A2. So the lowercase letters over here are the qualifiers on this side. So we're noting A because it was a direct observation of a population decline. We're noting C because the amount of Bermuda that cedars occupy has obviously gone down quite a lot since the 1940s. There is no exploitation, so this D one doesn't apply, but we are noting E, and that's for several reasons. There is evidence of hybridization between Bermuda cedar and some similar related introduced juniper species, but also because the scale insects that caused the blight are still present on the island. So this E applies to them. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how we apply the red list criteria to a species during an assessment. I'm just going to show you the rest of these quickly so that you have some idea of the information we needed to carry out this project. So under A here we have B, and B deals with the geography of a species distribution. So obviously the fewer places on Earth a species occurs in, the more vulnerable it is if something happens in those small spaces. So for Bermuda endemics, this is key because Bermuda is only 54 kilometers square. So that automatically puts us into this red area for a lot of these criteria. We also have a severely fragmented landscape. So we have little pockets of wild habitat intermixed with a lot of development. So this qualifier B, this is also really important for Bermuda because we have so many invasive species dominating most of our green spaces. This criteria C, this deals with the number of mature individuals. And that's important because mature individuals in your population are the ones that are capable of reproducing and sustaining the species. So the other thing I wanted to highlight about this one is this concept of population and subpopulation, because when we started this project, that's something I really had to get my head around. So for our purposes, our population is all of the plants growing on Bermuda. A subpopulation is some sort of ecologically meaningful subunit of that. So for example, I'm going to show you the Bermuda bean. There's a subpopulation of that at Walsingham, and there's another one out on Nonsuch Island, but they're not going to breed across Castle Harbor. So there's no gene flow between those two units. So we call them as separate subpopulations. So subpopulation size is important for things like inbreeding. It's also really important because a small subpopulation is more vulnerable. So for example, if you have a clump of 5 ferns growing at a site, and that's your entire subpopulation at the site, and a tree branch falls on those 5 ferns, then you've lost that species from a site. So obviously having all of your mature individuals in your total population in one subpopulation, that seriously increases the extinction risk for your species. So this criteria D, that's the easiest one to apply because you just look at the counted number of individuals. So again, if we think about the Bermuda bean, we counted 29 mature individuals. So if it's less than 50, it falls into this critically endangered box for criteria D. So I've shown you all that. Hopefully you now have some sense of what endangered and critically endangered means. And the endangered is a word that doesn't just mean there are a few less now than there used to be. So we started this project to redlist Bermuda's plants in May of 2023, and it was initiated by the Overseas Territories Group at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London. And it was a collaboration with the Bermuda government, with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. When we started this project, there were already 5 Bermudian plants on the red list, and we reassessed 4 of those. So the ones we reassessed were the Governor Lafan's fern, the wild Bermuda pepper, the olive wood, and the palmetto. We didn't do the cedar because there was an assessment that had just been done in 2011. We also did 5 other endemic plants, which were being put onto the red list for the first time with our assessments. And those 5 were the Bermuda shield fern, the Bermuda maidenhair fern, the Bermuda sedge, the Bermuda bean, and Darrell's fleabane. So aside from those assessments, we generated a lot of other things during this project, a lot of photographs and GPS points. And also during the pandemic lockdowns, I took the time to write all of this up. So there are now this report that's down here, and there's a similar report on native plants. And on the last slide, I'll show you links where you can go and read those reports. So this is the summary table from the front of that report, and it shows the outcomes of all of our assessments. And there are some caveats to these numbers. We know what we did wasn't perfect, but it was the best we could do with the time and resources that were available to us. and it's something that we can build on in the future. So these counts are only valid for the time period they were reported, so from 2013 to 2016. And we've made no attempts at keeping them current since then. Also, the numbers need to be interpreted as at least this many on public land between 2013 and 2016. So we know for the trees that there are many more on private land that we didn't get to count. Also, we didn't have access to some sites, so we weren't able to count those. And for some species in some places, we actually couldn't count them because there were just too many. But for the rarer species, we are reasonably confident that we got most, if not all of them. And the real importance of this work is not really the result here, but the fact that we can revisit those GPS points in 10 years' time and do those counts again, and then we will start to see trends over time. So I'm going to quickly show you the plants that we assessed, starting with the ferns. Bermuda has 3 endemic ferns, and we did assessments of all 3 of them. So the Governor LaFan's fern was the easiest one to assess because it has extinct in the wild status. It was last seen in the wild in 1905, and many people have been looking for it ever since, but no one has found it. So we did a very thorough survey of the Walsingham tract, and we didn't find it. The only location in the historic records where it was ever recorded to have been found was at Church Cave, which is down here. It's under the Ships Hill condos on the driveway there to the Tucker's Point Hotel. And this is the cave now. It's very overgrown with invasive plants. And I've searched it repeatedly over a 10-year time period, and many other people searched it before I did. So we can be reasonably confident that it's very unlikely that the fern is still there. There are no contributing criteria to an extinct in the wild status. You just have to be reasonably sure that it's gone from the wild. So collecting was the main reason that this fern declined in the wild, and that's obviously been stopped. The fern's been protected by law since 2007, but the habitat has changed so drastically in the 100 years since it was last seen in the wild that that's really going to hamper its recovery. There are only 44 species on the IUCN Red List that are extinct in the wild, so that's out of 62,666 plants that have been assessed for the Red List. So it's a bit sad that Governor LaFan's fern has joined that group. However, despite that conservation status, there is a lot of good news for this species. So this picture up here is adult ferns in a greenhouse in the United States. Some of you may know that we have a potted collection of LaFan's fern in Bermuda. They're held at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. And these were grown for us in a lab at the Henry Dorley Zoo in Omaha in the United States. And we've been planting them back into the wild since 2014. And a few of them have successfully survived for a number of years. There are some that have survived at Sears Cave for 7 years now. And in 2020, some of the ferns at Sears Cave began producing spores. So that was incredibly exciting. It is still considered extinct in the wild, and it will be until those planted ferns have produced viable offspring. So essentially until our plantings are grandparents. So we're hoping someday that we can move Governor LaFan's fern back a step from extinct in the wild to critically endangered. The second endemic fern that we assessed is my favorite. It's the Bermuda shield fern. And as you can see from all of this, the shield fern is facing a lot of threats. It's confined to the area that we call the Walsingham tract. And that's this area from the Grotto Bay Hotel and the Causeway down through Blue Hole Park and the Walsingham Trust, Painter's Vale, Painter's Hill, the Tucker's Point Hotel, and Tucker's Town. And this is the cave district of Bermuda, so it contains the oldest and hardest limestone. And as you can see from the scale bar, it's not a very big area, but it's incredibly important for endemic plants. And one reason for that is the geology provides the habitats that they need, but also because it's so rocky, it wasn't cleared for agriculture in the same way that the rest of Bermuda was. So a species can qualify for endangered status if it occurs at less than 5 locations, and we found Bermuda shield fern at 3. So the Grotto Bay Hotel, the Walsingham Trust, and Painter's Vale. And there's almost no chance of it spreading naturally from these places. So we need to keep in mind when we're looking at a map like this, that this is an endemic to Bermuda species. So this map is its global distribution. It's lost growing space to developments like the quarries and the hotels that are in this area, but it's also lost habitat quality because of invasive species. So one of the things we were asked to report on for the red listing is signs of reproduction. And we did find juvenile shield ferns at both the Grotto Bay Hotel and at Walsingham. One of the things I really believe is if we want to help endangered species recover, we need to make more of them and spread them around. And this bottom picture is a group of really large ferns at the Walsingham Trust. And I collected these spores from those in 2012 to see if I could grow shield ferns from spores. And I'm happy to report that it's possible and it wasn't all that difficult. So I was able to produce a potted collection of ferns, and those have since produced spores. So we've been able to plant those out into protected areas. So this is one at the Audubon Society's reserve at Sears Cave. And that's a site that didn't previously have this species. So the third species of endemic fern is the Bermuda maidenhair. And this is one of the 2 endemic plants that we assessed that was not in one of the threatened categories. And the population is considered stable. So maidenhair fern is widely dispersed around Bermuda. It's very capable of dispersing spores. And it's also good at using a range of habitats, and it's really well adapted to an urban environment. So it is, however, an island endemic. So one of the things that came out of the assessment is that if something else changes, because of Bermuda only being 54 square kilometers, the area of occupancy and extent of occurrence values mean that it could move into a threatened category if one of the other criteria begins to apply to it. So we didn't do counts for maidenhair fern because when we started this project, we hadn't actually intended to assess this fern, but we did record it at 56 sites from Dockyard to St. David's. So moving on to the flowering plants, I'm going to show you this first map, but then I'm not going to show you all of them because that would get a bit tedious. They are all in the report if you want to go and have a look at them. This is where we found the wild Bermuda pepper. And when you find peperomia, you usually find a patch of it because it has a jointed stem and it breaks apart at those joints and then the pieces root into the ground. And this is a plant that likes to grow on rocky features like karst outcrops and cave mouths. It's also found on old stone walls. And very often we found peperomia and Bermuda maidenhair fern growing together. We found them in places like face of Abbott's Cliff and the cave mouths all around the Walsingham area. This is what the fruits of the Bermuda pepper look like. They're tiny and they're also sticky, so they can attach to animals to be spread around. And can't see them under here because this is in the way, but their juveniles are under here. And they really don't spread that far from the parent. So this is a plant that will really benefit from us planting it out in more places. It's one that really could be used more as a garden house plant. You see ornamental peperomias around. The planter out in front of TCD is an ornamental peperomia that could easily be switched out for Bermuda pepper. The Bermuda sedge. We actually counted way more Bermuda sedge than I thought we were going to find when we first started this project. And that's actually good news. We found it at 15 sites. Nonsuch Island had the biggest population. We found over 200 out there. And those include plantings, but also the self-seeded offspring of those plantings. This here is a group. This is a rocky bank at Warwick Pond, and these are planted sedges and their self-seeded offspring. And they look a bit like grasses, but if you look in the middle of the leaf here, there's a very deep V-shaped valley in the middle of the leaf that marks it as a sedge. This is what the flowers look like in the Bermuda sedge. You can see a lot of pollen hanging out of them in the springtime, and they're followed by this seed head that looks a bit like wheat. And one of the main threats to the Bermuda sedge is that rats almost always destroy those seed heads before they have a chance to reproduce. And Bermuda sedge likes habitats like this one, where it's in the understory of a fairly sparse canopy, so it gets a lot of light and it's not competing with a lot of other plants. So in Paget Marsh, we found it up on the humps created at the base of palmettos, and also around the base of the really big cinnamon ferns, where the ground was a little bit drier. And this makes climate change a really big worry for us with this plant. We're already seeing climate change in endemic plant strongholds like Paget Marsh, and the low-lying peat marsh basins that are over the freshwater lenses are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. Most people are looking at the coast for evidence of sea level rise. But if you look at Paget Marsh is only 0.5 meter or 1.5 feet above sea level. So climate change is going to raise the water table in the marsh, and this is going to make it less suitable for trees and plants. David Wingate has already documented the death of a number of mature cedar trees in Paget Marsh in 2002, and that was caused by a warm water eddy from the Gulf Stream. And similar eddy-induced high water events occurred again in 2011 and in 2017. And this event in 2017, it lasted from September to December. So if the ground becomes permanently saturated like this with standing water, that's going to completely prevent the recruitment of new seedlings on the ground. And it's also going to drown the mature plants. So if the peat becomes saturated, it's going to make it a lot harder for those mature palmettos to remain standing during hurricanes. So a palmetto is an extremely heavy plant. It has a lot of water in its trunk. So if it's standing in peat that is the consistency of chocolate pudding, and you then apply hurricane force winds to the top of that tree, we're going to see a lot more of them blowing down. Also, sea level rise could make the substrates in the marsh more salty, and that's obviously also going to kill the plants. So the Bermuda bean was assessed as critically endangered, and that was because of this D criteria. It was because of the small number of mature plants. And we found it at 5 sites in 2014. And those sites were the Walsingham Trust, Nonsuch Island, the Gladys Morrill Nature Reserve up in Somerset, Sears Cave, and the Save Open Spaces Nursery on the edge of Devonshire Marsh. And I know now that it's gone from 2 of those 5 sites. So the largest subpopulation was at Walsingham, and there were 18 mature plants there. So this represents 69% of our total population. So obviously, for conservation purposes, having 2/3 of all your plants in one place is not a great situation. I think I said the main, if you have fewer than 50 mature plants, you can qualify for critically endangered. And we had 29 for Bermuda bean. We did find very encouraging signs of reproduction for the Bermuda bean. There's a table in the report that deals with flower color. And Bermuda bean is known to have both white and pink flowers. But after over a decade of looking, I've never seen the white flowered variety. We did see the pink flowers at Sears Cave and at Walsingham. And we were seeing seedlings among the rocks at Walsingham, which we were fairly sure were Bermuda bean, but we weren't sure. So we got some seeds and planted them up in pots so we could see what the seedlings looked like. The main lookalike seedlings in Walsingham are from Morning Glories. Bermuda bean puts out these pointy tipped leaves as its first pair of leaves, whereas the morning glory puts out this pair of sort of goat's foot shaped leaves first, and then it puts out a pair of pointy tipped leaves. So up here you can see the bean pod. They're flat and they're green when they're new, and then as they mature they round out and become dry like this, and then they pop open and you get these dark brown beans. There's 2 to 5 beans in a pod, never more than 5. Our assessment for the Darrell's fleabane was the first time that it made it onto the red list. And this is the other plant that didn't fall into one of the threatened categories. It came out as near threatened, and that's because it is still reasonably abundant compared to our other endemic plants. But having said that, South Shore Park, which is everything from Warwick Long Bay to Horseshoe Bay, that contained 1/3 of the global population of this plant. And that's why you have to look at these distribution maps with a bit of a critical eye. If I was going to do this report again, I would put all of the places that we searched on here with an open circle if they didn't have fleabane, because then you get a better sense of where it was actually absent or where we just didn't look for it. This map's also a bit misleading because each of these dots, one of these dots could be 100 plants or 1 plant, and they're equally weighted with these symbols. It appears equally distributed along the South Shore, but in fact, 61% of the plants we mapped were in Warwick and Southampton. So this is a plant that prefers sandy soils and sunny positions, and it also likes rocky substrates. So the rock cuts along the edge of the railway trail, and other sites where we recorded a lot of them were the railway trail in Southampton and the railway trail in Bailey's Bay. We also saw a lot of them growing out of the old forts, so especially at Fort Scour and the walls of the forts out here on Castle Island. So Darrell's fleabane has a lot of lookalikes, and several of the species that are in the same genus as this are also weeds in Bermuda. And when it's flowering between sort of late February and the end of June, it's really easy to identify. But the rest of the year, it's a bit unassuming and looks a bit like a weed. So one of the telltale identifiers are these little tiny teeth that are along the edge of the leaves. This is the seed head down here for the Darrell's fleabane. They're these little puff balls that release these wind-dispersed seeds. So the ability of this plant to spread is limited to the local area around the parent plant. So it's usually found in clumps. And the flowers are these clusters of little daisy-like white flowers. Sometimes they're tinged with pink, like this one. This is another example of Darrell's fleabane looking and behaving like a weed. This is the wall of the battery down at Great Head Park in St. David's. And in the photo on the right here, that's the Darrell's fleabane on the top. And the plant on the bottom is a weed, which is the white beggar's tick. And the key difference there is the fleabane flower is lots of little tiny thin petals that, like I showed you on that last slide. But the white beggar's tick has these flat, big flat petals. So we reassessed the olive wood. It was moved from vulnerable, where it had been assessed in 1998, to endangered following our assessment. And there were lots of things that were contributing to this endangered status, including a continued population decline, and that was due to invasive species, development, and hurricanes. And the fact that wild self-seeded olive woods occur only in small pockets of old woodland, so mainly in the Walsingham tract. So if you remember that area I showed you before, The Walsingham tract accounted for 29% of the mature olive woods that we mapped. And some of these trees are absolutely enormous and they're quite spectacular. But we found in most parks that olive woods are underrepresented. So if we found a planting of endemic trees, usually it was mostly cedars with a few palmettos, and occasionally there'd be one olive wood, if any. So olive wood is really a tree that deserves to be planted more. It needs to be placed in places where this size of growth can be taken into account. One of the interesting things we found was that the city of Hamilton actually has 95 mature olive wood trees, both in the city parks and as street trees. So that's Bermudiana Road there, the row of olive woods. And this red listing project really brought home to me the impact that rats can have on island vegetation. We surveyed 139 sites during this project, and we found olive woods at 86 sites. Of those 86 sites, we only found juveniles at 6 sites. So that's an incredibly small number of juveniles, and it basically means that there is no natural recruitment in the wild, so there are no adults joining this population. So that means that the olive wood really is depending on continued planting for its continued existence. So without conservation measures, the olive wood would cease to exist. And the main reason for that is that rats and invasive plants have disrupted its reproduction to such an extent. So on the mainland, we very often found chewed seeds like this around the olive woods. But if you go out to Nonsuch Island, which is kept rat-free, the number of olive wood seedlings is really startling. This is a photo that I took sitting on the ground out on Nonsuch, looking into the woodland, and it's absolutely choked with seedling and sapling olive woods. So compare that photo to 6 sites finding 1 or 2 juveniles on the mainland. So the palmetto was another species that was already on the red list, and it had been assessed as endangered in 1998. And our assessment came out with the same result, but with a lot of contributing criteria. There are some subpopulations of palmetto that are self-sustaining, so places like Nonsuch and Paget Marsh, but many of them are not, so it will continue to decline without active planting, but also without active habitat management and invasive species control. And these are the main reasons that it remains endangered despite this high number of trees. So this photo over here, this is the palmetto hammock forest in the Butterfield Nature Reserve in Point Shares. And there's about 9 acres of this habitat left on Bermuda. There's about 1 acre at the Butterfield Reserve, about 1 acre out on Morgan's Island in Ely's Harbor. There's about 7 acres of it in Paget Marsh, and there's a little bit of it out on Trunk Island as well. And this is the only endemic plant-dominated habitat type that is left in Bermuda now that the cedar forests are gone. So palmetto was the tree that we mapped at the most sites. We saw it at 110 of the 139 sites that we visited. And this abundance is because it's able to tolerate a range of substrates. So everything from peat to beach sand to extremely thin soils over karst limestone. So it's not fussy about habitat, and that's really good from a conservation standpoint. It's also very tolerant of disturbance. So a lot of the palms that we mapped in Devonshire Marsh were within the zone that burned in the fire back in 2017. And a lot of those palms were able to resprout and recover. And palmettos also transplant really well, even if they're fully grown when you try to move them. So for that reason, there really is no excuse for us to lose any more of them to development. What we are losing palmettos to the most is invasive species. So palmetto trunks seem designed to catch things. So invasive species are really problematic for them, especially these two species. This is the Australian umbrella tree, and this is a big one growing off the trunk of this palmetto. There's also some smaller ones up here in the crown. And this is right out in the middle of Walsingham, not near any houses. So these are bird drop seeds. This is also in Walsingham. This is a palmetto with a number of Indian laurels. There's a big one growing up the front here. There's an equally sized tree growing around the back of this palm tree. And I think this tree has in fact died since I took this picture because it can't cope with the weight of having this parasite growing up its trunk. Invasive animals are also a big problem for palmetto. So it seems like everything likes to chew on the poor old palmettos. Comstockiella sabellus is a palmetto scale that was introduced in 1921, and it's reasonably common still today, but the trees seem to be coping with it. There are a number of introduced parasitoids that were brought in to try to deal with this scale insect. There's also a number of scale predators on the island, so things like ladybugs will eat the palmetto scale. Rats are also a big problem for the palmetto. They chew the berries before they've had a chance to ripen, so they essentially destroy the seed before it even develops. But in a way, everything wanting to chew on the palmettos is a good thing. Bermuda palmetto is a really excellent wildlife tree. It provides food and nesting materials, and it provides flowers for nectar and for pollen. It's great for birds, bees, lizards, snails, land crabs, all sorts of things. The rats, unfortunately, also like to chew the crowns of the palmettos in dry weather for moisture, and that's the growing part of the palms. So them chewing on that will kill a mature palmetto tree. And last but not least, the cedar. We mapped over 6,000 of them in public spaces, and this was the most individuals of any of the plants that we counted. So it may seem odd that it's still critically endangered, but that's because of that population decline that I told you about. So this is a cedar seedling in the Botanic Gardens, and it's showing that classic fried egg appearance of a juniper scale. The number one site where we mapped, where we counted cedars was Hog Bay Park. That's Hog Bay in the middle of the slide there. And we counted 483 of them there. Second was Little Head Park down in St. David's. And number 3 was Lover's Lake and Ferry Point. So there are still some good assemblages of cedars on the landscape. Cemeteries and churchyards have always been regarded as refuges for large old cedars, and we didn't manage to get to all of them. But in the 12 churchyards that we did survey, we counted 174 mature trees. So I put this slide in for a little bit of perspective. I recently read this paper that Gordon Groves from the Department of Agriculture wrote in 1955. And he tells us that before 1942, when the scale insects began to kill the cedar trees, there were on average between 200 and 300 cedars per acre. So if you go to the Department of Planning's website, it tells you that the acreage of Bermuda is 13,227 acres. So if we take 2/3 of that number, because cedars wouldn't have covered all of Bermuda, and that number also includes the airport, which wasn't there before 1941. But if we use 2/3 of that number, and we use Groves's low-end estimate of 200 cedars per acre, that still gives us a potential pre-blight cedar population of 1,763,600 cedar trees. So the red listing report has an appendix table in it, and it shows the 139 sites that we surveyed and the counts within each of those sites and totals for each species. So from that, we can identify the top 3 sites that had most of the species we were looking for, and therefore are the most important for endemic species diversity. So unsurprisingly, Walsingham was number 1. It had 9 of the 10 species we were looking for. It was only missing the Darrell's fleabane. And I've got an asterisk there because during the Queen's Jubilee 70th planting initiative last year, we planted some fleabane at Walsingham, but it didn't survive, unfortunately. The second site was Nonsuch and Sears Cave. They both had 8 species. I think it's probably going to be easier to get sedge and fleabane to survive at Sears Cave than it is going to be to get those ferns to survive on Nonsuch, but there are potted specimens of everything around, so someone could have a go at that. The other thing we can identify from the appendix of the report are the sites that were important because of the sheer number of endemic plants that they hosted. So South Shore Park is the biggest of Bermuda's national parks, so it's not really surprising that it came out number 1 for the number of plants. Walsingham was number 2. Cooper's Island was 3rd, again, because it's a large site, but also because of the amount of planting work that's happened down there in recent years. So this is my last slide. This is the Red List website again. This is a website that we made for the red listing project, and all of the Bermuda assessments are on that website along with the reports. These are the 2 reports that I mentioned, and I've put the digital object identifier numbers here. If you want to take a picture of that slide, if you put this number into Google, it should take you directly to that document. So with that, thank you for having me. And I'll take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Alison, very much. Just to let you know, we have an online presence as well as an in-person presence. And just a special note to Dr. David Wingate, who's also in your thanks. I just want to let you know he's in our presence. So a gentleman who's dedicated his life to preserving and conserving our natural resources. So welcome, everyone, and we'll take questions. Yes.
Hi, Alison.
Hi.
About 40 years ago, I worked in a little guest house, and I had a guest there that the government had brought in to assess the cedar tree. And she told me, and I don't know how to, I mean, she told me this, so maybe you can confirm it. She said that the scale that the Bermuda cedar tree had gotten back in the 1940s, she actually told me that we didn't have to destroy the trees like we did because that was curable or something. She didn't use the word curable, of course, but she said, you know, it could have been reversed or whatever. Have you ever heard that? Because that's what she told me. And
yeah,
the
I've
government
heard
had bought
that, yeah, one of the species has actually died back quite a lot, and it's a lot more difficult to find now than the other one. But a lot of these things, you know, it depends on like if you spray chemicals, but obviously in Bermuda that wasn't an option at the time because of people's water tanks and just the sheer volume of it spread around the island. So there are a lot of scale insects that they do spray things for. They bought in a lot of insects as well. There was a laboratory, I think it was about 6 people hired full time, and they were breeding ladybird beetles and all sorts of other predatory insects to be released on the island to combat the scale.
Mm-hmm.
So they did do a lot of things to combat it. It was just the volume of it was too much for the cedars.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I'm sure David knows a lot more of what was done.
Maybe a related question. Why if the cedars died out so quickly in the 50s, why are some of them still about, and why are they not kind of perishing? What's changed?
Yeah, there was a subset of the cedars that were somewhat resistant to the scale. So I've heard this, and I've never seen it written anywhere, so I'm not sure I got this from, but somebody's told me that it's the gap between the scales in the cedar that was where the scales were going down into. So on some trees, that gap is a lot tighter, so they weren't as affected as badly. So I suppose it's like genetics. In any population, you have a small subset of organisms that have a certain trait that makes them less vulnerable to certain threats than everybody else. And it was that sort of less vulnerable 5% of the cedars that are the ones that survived. And those were the seeds that they used in the 60s and 70s for the reforestation projects for the cedar. But there's also literature that confirms that they were in fact seeing natural regeneration of the cedar in the 60s. So the cedar blight with the insects was not the first time that cedar was wiped out in Bermuda. We managed to wipe it out in the 1700s. They were chopping it down for shipbuilding. They were using it for everything they could possibly use wood for. They were burning it in fires. So they denuded the island completely and it managed to regenerate. One of the problems with it regenerating after the blight in the 40s was that we then flooded the landscape with all of these invasive trees. And that was the key difference. So this picture you're looking at the bottom here, this is from the top of the hill at Hog Bay. And these trees are all cedar trees. So some of those are relics, some of those are plantings, and those would be genetic stock from those resistant trees.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
There is a message in the chat. I don't know. Can you guys see that? Should I try and read it?
Yeah, if you can. Did they send it to you privately, maybe? Did they send it to you privately, Alison?
Oh, it just says questions welcome.
Oh, that's from me. That's from me. Actually, I'll take a question if that's okay, or ask a question.
Sure.
You mentioned Grotto Bay and replanting, reintroducing one of the ferns. I missed the fern, but I wanted to know if they supported you, and if so, in what way?
It was relic population actually. So because Bermuda shield fern was found in some of the caves on the property at the hotel. So they were very supportive of us tramping around the property for a day, just looking to see what we could find. I think they were a bit worried that we would find something and it would become a problem. But the cave bits of the property are already zoned as nature reserve. So really there was nothing we could find that would make it any more preserved, if you know what I mean.
Right. Okay, I was curious about that. Any other questions from the audience?
So if you ever go to brunch at Grotto Bay, there's that sort of walled cave right at the front of the property by the parking lot behind the bus stop there. If you look over the wall into that hole, that's where the shield ferns are.
Hi, Alison. Is there any easy way to tell the difference between a Darrell's cedar and a Bermuda cedar?
Other than saying it just looks wrong, it's difficult. And there's the Juniperus virginiana, which is the Virginia cedar, which is what we call Darrell's cedar. And then there's the subspecies silicola, which is what we call the Smith cedar. And David's done some work with a chap it was Baylor, and there's actually sort of 9 different combinations of Bermuda cedar crossed with those other 2 options. So it's not really a black and white situation. It's more like a spectrum from one to the other. So it's not like it's either this or this. It could be this, but kind of look like this, but kind of look like this kind of thing. So a lot of the really dark, bushy, dense looking junipers are the introduced one. A lot of the sort of sparser, more upright foliage, spiky, bluey gray ones are the Bermuda cedar. I don't know if David wants to say something about that. When we started doing this, if we saw a cedar that was really obviously foreign looking to us, we marked it as a Darrell's cedar, but otherwise we counted it. Because I couldn't hand on heart tell you that I could absolutely tell the difference every time.
And should we be concerned? Are we likely to lose the Bermuda cedar?
I think potentially that ship has sailed already, unfortunately. But I guess a cedar on the landscape is better than no cedar on the landscape, regardless of the identity of that cedar. It might be possible to back cross some of them. It is possible to clone cedars as well, but I've been told the result is not that vigorous. But if we start taking cuttings from some of the really old pre-blight cedars, those are genetically more pure Bermuda.
I worked in the hospitality industry over many years, and I regularly got this question from tourists, which I was never able to answer. And that was, where can the Bermudiana flower be found? Because God, I think I've only seen it a couple of times in my life. So I'm doing a little part-time work again back in the hospitality industry. So I like to be able to tell them, if they ask me again, where can they go and see this Bermudiana?
The trails behind Horseshoe Bay, so through the sand dunes, loads of Bermudiana there.
Okay.
The edges of railway trails. I can guarantee you one spot, and that is the Bermuda Botanical Society has created an endemic plant flower bed in the Botanic Gardens.
Okay.
So if you go down the walkway where the old aviary was, there's a flower bed right next to the stairs that are right next to Camden House. So there's a flower bed there with a big cedar tree in it. And there's a sign that lists a bunch of the endemic plants I talked about today. So all along the edge of that flower bed has been planted with Bermudianas.
Okay,
There's some white Bermudianas there too. So if you've never seen a white Bermudiana, go and look in the flower bed.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience for Alison? I had one. It might be a stupid question, but the palmetto scale insect that was introduced, I might have missed it. Why was it originally introduced in 1921?
I think it was an accidental introduction.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if it was a
As these
biological
things
control.
usually are. No.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thank you.
Because when it was first introduced, it was affecting the trees quite badly. So that's why they bought in a parasitoid, I think it was a wasp from Florida, and it lays its egg inside the scale and kills it.
Okay, thank you. Question? Okay.
Hi, good afternoon, Alison. You touched on earlier that you thought, or I guess another way to, I guess, revitalize or bring back the Bermuda cedars to probably clone it. What would that process entail, and is that a consideration, making it more resistant to some of these things that have eradicated it?
It's difficult to make things more resistant because a lot of it has to do with genetics, and because, island endemic species tend to be, I don't want to use the term weaker, but they're not well adapted to things like pests because they didn't have to be. So they spent more resources growing low and slow and being hurricane proof rather than being resistant to threats that they didn't face. So the cloning, it is, you take a cutting, you have to chill it, you have to put it in a mister, you wait for roots, and then you pot it up. I've never tried to do it. There are a lot of people with a lot of knowledge in that area because the government nursery did a lot of this work in the 80s. So there are a lot of people, former parks employees, that know this stuff. And, people sort of my generation, like, I don't know it. And I think we're losing that knowledge a little bit, which is a shame.
Yeah, have the mic.
First of all, I have to say that
I do.
in spite of a hearing aid, I'm still very hard hearing, and I can probably only say I got about a third of what you said. But thank goodness you had the handwritten things to go with it, because I was able to glean most of the statuses of the different plants that you've concluded, and I have to agree with you on a lot of that. I ran I started doing botanical surveys all over Bermuda in search of the surviving endemics and ferns. And I also set up some botanical quadrats in Paget. A number of natives and endemics seem to be surviving, which you also confirm.
Yeah.
And my conclusion from this is three decades that I conducted this from the late 60s all the way through to the end of my working career pretty well. And I concluded from that the native flora has just about no chance of surviving without intensive management. And that I looked at these trends for 3 decades, and it was so obvious from that. Also, what I found is that they did a heck of a lot better in gardens because these are managed areas. So that's the point, that all these things are only going to survive in managed areas. Now, the beautiful thing is that these days is about half of Bermuda is managed in the form of private gardens, botanical garden, and so forth, some of the nature reserves. Fortunately, do make up a significant part of our total land area. And if you look at these, this is where you have the best hope of restoring significant populations. I like to think of the olivewood as one of the great examples that years ago, like in the 50s and 60s, it only survived in Walsingham that we knew of. And no one seemed to appreciate its value and beauty as a garden plant. So I tried to promote it through the Tula Valley Nursery, and it became suddenly very popular in the commercial nurseries as well. And it looks so beautiful when it's standing out on its own. It doesn't seem to do well in these invasive forests that we have now. It grows too tenuously, but it's such a beautiful tree in gardens. And I would say that that is vastly more. It's the percentage of olivewoods is now probably 9 times as great as it was when I first started working. So the main hope, my bottom line is that the main hope for saving most of our endemics is in private gardens. And the key is that we have to educate people to want to plant things in their native gardens. And a few people are, but I'm hoping that with education, we can persuade nearly every gardener to plant some natives in their garden. The best example that I've come across lately, as I'm surveying some of the gardens with Lisa Green, is the Chudleys, Shirley Bay. The Chudleys restoration is mostly native and endemic in their gardens. And they're even beginning to restructure the native plant community, which is very different from individual plants scattered in gardens. So there's tremendous hope in the private gardens, provided we can educate gardeners to appreciate the significance of planting them. So I think that's most of what I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Wingate, for those words. Are there any further questions for Alison before we wrap up for today? No. All right. Well, Alison, we want to, on behalf of Bermuda College and BEST, we give you our sincere, heartfelt thank you for sharing this really important information. I was my biggest learn from today was the olive wood. I thought it was a sturdy plant, and hearing how vulnerable it is really opened my eyes to the importance of protecting our endemics and of course natives. So thank you for dedicating your PhD topic to this important cause, and hopefully you'll come back and ensure that Bermuda's conservation is ongoing. So thank you for that. And just want to thank the audience for coming, whether you're online or in person. If you want to watch this again or share it with friends, it's going to be on our YouTube channel. So if you go to BC YouTube, there's a playlist section, and then all of our BC Eco Lunch and Learns are there. And we've had so many over the years. It also is potentially on the BEST website. Of course. And just before I forget, this is our last one for the season, but we'll be picking it back up in September. So if you want to come again, please sign our sign up sheet. Also, if you have ideas of topics that you would like us to present, you can email me, aharvey@college.bm. Jennifer and I are going to be brainstorming over the summer for the next 6 topics that are going to happen September through November, and then February through April next season. So thank you for coming. And Jennifer just has a couple of words. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Just following on with what David was saying and what Alison's been saying, the Bermuda Botanical Society, in conjunction with the Bermuda National Trust of Miles Darrell, are hoping to host a propagation workshop in early June, which will focus mainly on endemics. So if you want to learn more about how to propagate those, I'm not sure what methods Miles will be using, but cloning may well be one of them. David did mention the document that he is working on with Lisa Green to help people understand how to work with endemics in their own gardens, endemics and natives. Going to the Bermuda Botanical Gardens, just a reminder, Bermudiana does die down after it's flowered. So if you're here looking at the in summer, you're probably not going to see it. So it's the spring flower, and that's when you need to look. But in that endemic section at the Bermuda Botanical Gardens, which is looked after by the Botanical Society, thank you, Alison, we are trying to reintroduce plants that have been having difficulties. It's only a small area, so we obviously can't get everything in there. And anybody who would like to come and help out with the planting and weeding and maintenance will be more than welcome. And I'd also like to thank Amy and the Bermuda College for allowing the free use of these facilities for these presentations. We very much appreciate them. And Diago, who some of you will have seen earlier, the technician who has saved Amy and I many times with his technical knowledge. So a thank you to them too. And enjoy the summer weather, everyone. Thanks.